What questions do you ask yourself to help reflect on the past year and plan for the upcoming one? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hello and welcome to Verbal to Visual. I'm your host, Doug Neill, and today I'd like to share with you a framework that I've used for many years, particularly around the start of a new year when I'm going through an annual review process. But I think asking yourself these questions can be helpful at any stage of the year, at any point in life, especially when you're not as satisfied with your life as you'd like to be. This framework was developed by Jonathan Fields, whose podcast, Good Life Project, is a great listen. I will link to a conversation that he had with Corbett Barr of Fizzle, where they talk about his book, I think also called Good Life Project. And within that video, they talk about this framework. Here, I'll share with you a visual template that I created to help me reflect on the past year and plan for the upcoming one. So I'd like to share that template and also my responses. So the idea here is to think fairly broadly about how you spend your time, where you put your energy, and to what degree you contribute to each of these three buckets. These are the three areas of life that Fields has identified as being important to have that overall sense of satisfaction, to feel like you're living a good life. And what I like about these is that they are, of course, broad enough that each person's individual good life looks different from someone else's, but that across the board, you kind of do need to be checking all of these boxes, so to speak. One bucket is this contribution bucket. The question here is, how are you bringing your gifts to the world? Now, in a lot of cases, folks will think about their profession, but it doesn't necessarily have to be work-related. It could have to do with the role that you play in the lives of your family members and friends and community. So in this reflective mode, think about what you poured into this contribution bucket over the past year. The next one here is this connection bucket. The question here, how are you building meaningful relationships with others? To what degree have you put time and energy into those relationships that are important to you? And the third bucket here is the vitality bucket. How are you taking care of your mental, physical, and emotional health? And those three pieces are, of course, very interconnected. So you could just think about your health broadly. But for me, it is helpful to identify those three specific pieces because different types of activities contribute to those three areas of health. So this part of it is probably somewhat common knowledge. These categories aren't going to surprise anybody, I don't think. But what I think is worth pointing out, first of all, common knowledge is not necessarily common practice. So even though you know these things contribute to a good life, that doesn't necessarily mean you are putting the energy needed into each of these buckets. But on top of that, for me, kind of the major light bulb with this framework is this piece here, that the height of the least filled bucket will cap the potential of the other two. Another way to think about it is that if you're not sufficiently filling one of those buckets, you're essentially poking holes in the other two. So these pieces are interconnected. They're not independent. If you don't pour enough into that vitality bucket, that's going to have a detrimental impact on your connections and the contributions that you're attempting to make. Similarly, if you're not giving enough attention to the connections you make with other people, that's going to affect your ability to bring your gifts to the world. And it's going to make it harder to take care of your mental, physical, and emotional health. So that's why I like this framework in particular when it comes to conducting an annual review, because it helps me to see what are the buckets that I did a pretty good job of filling over the past year and what might need more attention. Where is there an imbalance in my priorities that I need to address? So that's where these couple of steps come into play here. The first step being responding to this question: in what way did you fill these three buckets last year? That's what this space within each bucket is for. And you could even try to get the height, the water level of each of those buckets, have them kind of correspond to the overall balance of your efforts. And then that second step is the question, what new contributions would you like to prioritize next year? That's what this space above the buckets is for. And even though this type of activity fits great as an annual review, something that you do at the end of one year as you kind of roll over to the start of the next, keep in mind you don't have to wait until December or January to do this type of reflection. You can do it in any moment of time, and particularly I think it's a good framework to turn to when your life doesn't feel balanced overall, or you're not as satisfied with it as you'd like to be. Now I'm going to share how I filled out this diagram as I look back at 2020 and make some plans for 2021. Before I do that, I wanted to mention that this template here is available as a high quality download in case you want to print it out or maybe add it to your tablet so that you can respond to these prompts. That's available within Verbal to Visual, which is a membership site where we've got a bunch of complete at your own pace online courses connected to developing the skill of sketchnoting. We also have weekly live webinars where we do sketchnoting workshops, and I share some downloadable resources like this here. So I encourage you to join us there, both to get this template in a high quality download and also as a place to share how this activity goes for you once you fill in those blank spaces with your own words and sketches. You can find a link to learn more about Verbal to Visual down below this video. With that, let me get into how these buckets are looking for me right now. Let's start with the past year. I think the first thing to mention is how weird and challenging of a year it was with a global pandemic. So if you do go through this activity looking back at 2020, do go easy on yourself and take into account the circumstances that were outside of your control. For me, looking at that contribution bucket this past year, some of the highlights were a new course that I developed called Digital Sketchnoting, exploring how to use the tablet and stylus tool combination for your visual note taking. That's what led to me using a tool like Concepts here for some of my sketchnoting and video creation. I also made a lot of YouTube videos this past year and have done quite a bit of experimenting with different formats. In some cases, sticking with the analog pen and paper approach that I enjoy. Other times using a tablet and trying out different versions of storytelling in this way. I also launched a new podcast where I'm recording and sharing one-on-one coaching calls with up-and-coming sketchnoters. Other folks like you watching perhaps that are building their visual note-taking skills. On the connection side of things, this one of course has been tricky with COVID in mind, and there are really kind of two main components here that I think about. One, a pretty strong home life and a growing family. My wife and I bought and moved into our house at the very beginning of this year. We've been taking on a bunch of projects to make it more our own, and we're now kind of ramping up those projects as we get ready to bring some kids into the picture. My wife is pregnant with twins, on track to make it into the world about mid-March or early April. So we are, of course, very excited about that addition to our family and doing what we can to prepare for it. With the pandemic in mind, it's been harder to maintain broader social ties. But what I feel good about is the stronger community elements that I've built into Verbal to Visual. I mentioned that membership site a few minutes ago. This past year, there have been a couple of interesting developments there. First, I kind of moved Verbal to Visual to a new platform. I moved it from a WordPress site that I managed myself over to Mighty Networks, which is a really cool platform that does a great job of blending courses and community. So it's been really fun to connect on a deeper level with the folks who sign up for the sketchnoting resources that I've built over the years. And it's those connections that have helped to offset to some degree what I've been lacking in in-person social interaction. Then onto the vitality bucket. Again, tricky with COVID in mind. I've been leaning pretty hard on some of my routines. A couple years ago, I established this kind of 3-day exercise routine that I have found to work really well for me. I go for a run one day, do yoga the next, some strength training after that, and then start the cycle over again. What I may or may not have mentioned on this channel before is that I also rely on therapy as a resource, which for me is a great place to kind of keep tabs on the mental and emotional aspects of my health. Those conversations that I have every other week are great check-ins to be able to talk about how I'm doing right in that moment. how things have been going lately. And over time, talking with the same person about those things just makes it so much easier to recognize patterns, both those positive patterns and cycles that work well for you, but also maybe the negative patterns that someone else might be able to see and point out in those moments when it might be cloudy to you. So that's kind of a summary of the role that therapy has played in my life over the past year. And that process is one that I started about 2.5 or 3 years ago, I think. And it is one of those benefits that builds over time. I think the same can be said for the other 2 habits that I mentioned here, morning journaling and daily meditation. Those are great opportunities to kind of externalize your thoughts, get a little bit better perspective on them, and then also kind of more generally clear your mind and be intentional about where you're placing your attention. I think I've come to identify one of my core values around the quality of my attention. So these practices kind of give me opportunities to check up on where my attention currently lies, where it's been lately, and whether I feel like I need to shift that attention. And in looking at these 3 buckets as a whole, though I've kind of filled the space of each, I don't think they quite all feel full as I think about the past year. I think maybe a more accurate waterline would be probably around 2/3 full across the board. And it's with the things that I am going to focus on throughout the upcoming year that I hope to maybe fill in that last third with each of these buckets. So moving left to right again, thinking first about that contribution bucket. One area that I'd like to prioritize a bit more is doing my own sketchnoting. Sometimes I prioritize supporting other sketchnoters over continuing to do my own sketchnoting. And my goal with this project from the get-go has always been to have a good balance of both. And I think that's what's required of me too as an instructor, always being a practitioner in addition to being an educator. So I'm going to continue looking for opportunities to do my own sketchnoting of books and articles that I read, podcasts that I listen to, and videos that I watch. And as I'll share in a future video, I want to build that into the daily and weekly and monthly systems that I've created for myself. That's kind of the next stage here after you've done this reflecting. I think a good follow-up action is to turn your attention towards what systems you might create for yourself to address the ways in which you'd like to fill these buckets. In addition to that, personal sketchnoting, a large component of my 2021 will be the weekly workshops that I'm hosting within Verbal to Visual. And I like that those help to fill both the contribution bucket and the connection bucket. Within each of those workshops, we focus on a specific topic related to sketchnoting. I share a bit of instruction, but then we open it up for a broader conversation. We started doing those workshops weekly about a month ago, and I'm super excited to continue that throughout 2021 as one of the main levers for momentum within Verbal to Visual to help you continue growing and applying your sketchnoting skills. You can always check out the events page on Verbal to Visual if you want to see the next handful of workshops that are coming up. Then, within that contribution bucket, as I already mentioned and depicted in that double baby stroller, by the way, we already picked that up. That was a whole bunch of research. So there will be 2 new humans to take care of and spend time with starting early in 2021. That will, be the focus of my year and the rest of my life, I suppose. So that is the most important new contribution to that connection bucket. I've also recognized that I kind of need to prioritize and get back to more one-on-one interactions with friends. This might be the piece that has been the most challenging because of COVID, how it removed that ability to go meet up at a coffee shop with a friend, maybe for a co-working session, maybe just to catch up. I have been missing that dearly and look forward to getting back to it. Initially, maybe just with a walk around a neighborhood, but hopefully eventually before the end of 2021, actually hanging out at coffee shops again. For me, that will probably be the biggest indicator that we have kind of gotten back to some sense of normalcy. And finally, within the vitality bucket, in addition to maintaining the elements that are already there, the new thing, shouldn't say new, more like ongoing piece, connected in particular to mental health, is this desire to separate productivity from my sense of self-worth. As someone who is fairly focused on high achieving in school, doing well in sports, a little bit of a perfectionist in most of the things that I do, those ties between self-worth and productivity, self-worth and perfection, they're pretty strong. But I want to intentionally dismantle them, both because it's not helpful in the career path that I've chosen, tying my self-worth to the things that I create each week, my perceived quality of those things. That does way more harm than good. Add on top of that, new parenthood, which is going to throw a whole lot of uncertainty and chaos into our lives. That also makes me want to double down a little bit on my efforts to dismantle and rethink where my self-worth comes from, with the working theory that placing my self-worth more within that realm of the quality of my attention, I think that's where I'd like it to lie. So this kind of represents some of the most important things that have gone on throughout 2020, as well as what I'm thinking about for 2021. And I hope that hearing me talk through these pieces of my life maybe helped you think through what these buckets look like for you right now. And again, I would say lean on the side of being compassionate with yourself this year in particular, but every year. And then from here, we can use this reflective activity to help inform what comes next. And for me, the next step in this process is to take a look at the systems that I've created for myself, the daily routines, the weekly schedules. Take a look at those systems and check to make sure that there is space in those systems for the priorities that I've identified. I plan to share another video pretty soon here about those systems, so stay tuned for that. And as I mentioned, if you'd like a high quality version of this template for yourself and to see how others are filling it out, come join us within Verbal to Visual. That's the contribution that I'm bringing into the world, and I'm trying to make that a great place for folks who want to develop their sketchnoting skills and put those skills to use both in their personal and professional lives in a meaningful way. And I feel pretty lucky that that space is contributing more and more to that connection bucket as well. So thank you if you have been a part of that community. And for those who aren't yet but want to check it out, you can find more info at verbaltovisual.com. Do be sure to also go check out that interview with Jonathan Fields and check out his work at Good Life Project. If this framework resonated for you, chances are the rest of his work will as well. Thank you so much for watching. See you again in the next video.